Welcome to the video on draws. What are we going to talk about? Is this art? Is this science? What does the word draw mean in chess? Like other sports, it is possible to tie in chess. There is not necessarily always going to be a winner and loser of the game. Okay? So ties are possible. This is called a draw in chess. Now, there are a few ways a draw can take place, but for our purposes right now, we are going to cover the two most important and maybe common ways to draw for beginners. There are some other ways that we will cover in future lessons. Okay? So, the first way the game can end in a draw is by way of what's called insufficient checkmating material. That's a big, complicated phrase. All it really means is neither player is able to checkmate the other due to the amount of pieces or which pieces are left on the board. All right? So the easiest case for this is if all the pieces are off the board and there are literally only kings left, then obviously the game ends in a tie, right? Because kings can't checkmate each other. So the game is just over. There are no pieces left. That's it. It's a draw. All right. But there are a few other cases too in which a player has insufficient checkmating material. All right. So one example is with a lone bishop. All right. A king and a bishop cannot checkmate a lone king just by themselves. All right. For evidence of this, check this out. Even if the king were backed into the corner, all right, on the same color as the bishop, there is no possible piece placement for white that could lead to a checkmate in this case. Don't believe me? Let's look. Okay, so here we have a position as optimal as possible. The king on f7 is as close as possible to the king on h8, and obviously the white bishop is going to have to deliver check at some point in order to deliver checkmate. But what you'll notice is there is never an arrangement of the pieces where all three of black's potential escape squares can be covered at the same time while a check is delivered. It's just physically not possible. In this case, of course, the black king can escape to h7, but notice it wouldn't make a difference. If the white king were on g6, black could move to g8. Okay, so no matter how hard you try, this is a futile effort. The game, if it's ever king and bishop versus king, is an automatic draw. Another example of this is king and knight versus king. Same exact thing. All right, this game is an automatic draw. There is no point in playing on. Once again, to demonstrate, even with the king in the corner and the kings as close as possible to each other and the knight delivering a check, okay, there will always be an escape square for the opposing king to go to. If you don't believe me, you can try to arrange it yourself at home, and you might get a little frustrated, and that's because it's not possible. All right, so you may be thinking, okay, well, if a lone bishop and lone knight are forced draws and impossible to win, then obviously a pawn, which is worth less than a bishop or a knight, must also be a forced draw as well, right? Which I guess is kind of logical thinking. A lone pawn can't checkmate a king. And you would be right, except that remember, with regards to the rules of pawns, if a pawn gets to the other side of the board, you can get a queen, all right? And then from there, you can checkmate with a lone queen, in conjunction with the king, of course. So yes, while a lone pawn can't checkmate the king by itself, what can happen, so for example, let's play this out for a second, is once this pawn goes down the board, if black allows, in this case, white to achieve this, just to prove an example here, white can get a queen upon reaching the 8th rank, all right, and can then checkmate from there. Okay, so for this video's purposes, for beginner purposes, just remember that a lone bishop lone knight, and obviously 2 kings left are all forced draws, no questions asked. All right. But with a pawn, in this case, if you're able to get it to the other side of the board, you can get a queen and checkmate from there. All right. So kind of like we covered in a previous video, we can reach a situation like this where black, in this case, has been checkmated. Okay, so while insufficient checkmating material is one criteria for a forced draw, the other is called stalemate. What does this word mean? Well, there's the word mate in there, just like checkmate, but the prefix is changed from check to stale. All right, so what stalemate means is when you or your opponent cannot move your king or any other piece and you are not in check. It's kind of like you're in handcuffs and you can't move. The game ends in a forced draw. So the easiest way to help reinforce this is to just show you some examples that can occur and also give you some words of advice. Okay, so check this out. If we rearrange white's king and queen here, if it is black's move in this position, the game is over, the game is a draw. This is called stalemate. Why is this stalemate? Well, if we notice, if it's black's move, black cannot legally move to any of these 3 potential squares because they're protected by white's pieces. But notice that the black king is also not currently in check. Right? So this is a huge distinguishing factor. If it was white's move, of course, there would be a number of ways to checkmate the black king because you would be putting the king in check and also not preventing it from moving anywhere. However, if the king is not in check and it also cannot move anywhere, then this is actually a draw. All right, which would be very bad for white because obviously white is completely winning here. Okay. In this position, however, this is not stalemate. This is not a draw. Here's why. While it is true that nothing has really changed that much, black's king on a8 still is not in check and cannot move to either of these 3 squares. Black now has this extra pawn on f5, right, which is legally able to move forward 1 square, right? So if any other piece is able to move, this is not stalemate. Stalemate literally means that nothing else can move, and there's no check given. Okay, so this is not stalemate because black only has 1 move in this position, and it's forced. There's no other choice, right? So black will move here, and then white has his choice on how to deliver checkmate. Compare and contrast that with this example. Once again, if it were black's move in this position, this would be a stalemate. Okay? The difference here is that because white's pawn is on f4, this is blocking and preventing any forward movement from black's pawn on f5. And then the same criteria is met, right? Nothing else can move, black's king is not in check, and it cannot move. The game ends in a draw, and it is stalemate. All right, so you have to be, depending on which side you are, you have to be very careful in the situation. If you're the side that's winning and up tons of pieces and material, you have to watch out for putting your opponent in stalemate because you don't want to lose half a point by not checkmating your opponent. On the flip side, if you are losing and down in material, you can always look for ways and cute strategies to try to create a situation where you can put yourself into stalemate because that would be kind of the best case scenario for you. Let's take a look at a few more examples. Okay, so here, right, leaving the example for the queen for a second, this is another stalemate if it's black's move, right? So go through the criteria. Is black's king in check? No. Can black's king move to any possible square? No. All 3 are protected, right? Does black have any other pieces on the board that can move? No, it's just the king. All right, so easy example. Obviously, if it's white to play, bishop to d4 is checkmate, but it's not, so this game would end in a draw. Okay? To give you an example, adding a little complicated wrinkle in here as to how you can look for these ideas if you are losing in a game of chess, take this position as an example. So here we have a situation where black is currently down a full rook and pawn for absolutely nothing. So down 6 points in total, definitely losing, has the lone queen left for a last hurrah, hoping for something miraculous. However, if we look at black's king position, we notice, or we should pick up on the fact, that its scope is very limited. There aren't any squares it can currently move to. So in your mind, if you're black, you should be saying, aha, if there is a way to make it be my move and I can't move anything else, then I can actually secure a draw in this game and salvage half a point. All right, now obviously with this queen here on f7, it can move to many different squares. So this is certainly not stalemate because the black king can't move, but the queen obviously can. However, if you kind of put 2 and 2 together, and again, this will just come with practice, you may be able to find the best move for black in this position. The answer is queen to g6 check. All right, a very unusual and counterintuitive looking move, right? This looks silly. You are giving away your queen for nothing. However, check out what this does. So first of all, the white king has no choice, right? The king can't move anywhere. It has to take the queen on g6, but then voila. We have successfully achieved stalemate from black's perspective, okay? Because, look, the black king cannot move anywhere, okay? And black's lone pawn, once again, is blocked. All right, so this game would end in a draw. And so this is just an example of how you can save a game when you're losing. Now, on the flip side, you of course have to be careful. So the easiest way to think about how to not accidentally stalemate your opponent or to prevent from getting tricked into a forced situation like this, the way I would think about it, in simplistic terms, when you're trying to deliver checkmate to a king, for example, is just pay attention to breathing room. Make sure the king has at least one square to move to at all times. Right? So in this situation, remember, this here on b6 is stalemate, but just simply one square back on b5 is not stalemate at all, right? Because the king has this a7 square to move to, and that has no choice but just to move back and forth between these two squares. The moment the king moves to a7, for example, a checkmate can be delivered. Okay? So the two bishop example, same thing here. Notice that just with a small modification, the king went from f7 to g6. That makes all the difference, right? Because now the king has these two free squares on g8 and h8 to operate on, and then you just have to coordinate your bishops to deliver checkmate. So, for example, the king moves here, check, followed by mate. So again, simplistic terms, but just important to keep an eye out for it. Final example. Keep in mind that if you recognize you might be allowing a stalemate, unless it's absolutely forced, you don't need to allow it to happen, right? So take this position, for example. Black has just played rook to d4 check. Now, the first instinct would be king takes d4, but what you might realize is that if you take this rook, you have stalemated black, right? Black's king is not in check. He has no legal moves, right? And his lone piece of material left, the pawn here on h7, also cannot move. So the game is a stalemate and ends in a draw. However, nothing was forcing white in any way, shape, or form to take this rook on d4. There's no reason to give up a half point in this game when white is currently winning. I mean, he's up 2 full pawns, right? Which you can count and see right here. So in this situation, white can simply play king to c3, for example, and not take this rook, and then ask black what they're going to do next, okay? Because if black tries the same thing and wants to keep following the king, notice that now, since there's a vacant square opened up, this is nothing anymore. King takes rook is just simply obvious. Black has a legal move, and the game continues, and white will go on to win. All right, so to recap, there is such a thing as ties in chess. We call it a draw. There are a few ways a draw can be achieved. For beginner purposes, the two important ways to learn about a draw: number one, insufficient checkmating material. This can come in the form of a lone bishop or knight, not a pawn, right? Or stalemate, a situation where a king is not in check, it has no legal moves, and any other pieces on the board cannot move either of its own color. Feel free to practice the examples that go along with this video. Thank you for watching.